Hello, I'm Matthew Malcolm with American Vineyard Magazine, reporting to you here today with Jeff Bitter, president of Allied Grape Growers in Fresno. Wanted to talk about a recent webinar that you held in conjunction with California Association of Wine Grape Growers on contracts. Obviously, smoke exposure is a threat that we have to take seriously every year. Last year was a disaster.
Yeah, so over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had some significant smoke events in California somewhere in a wine growing region that has caused economic harm to growers. So last year, of course, was the kind of the culmination of all of those different events at different times in one harvest for most of the coastal California. So it became kind of front and center on most people's radar in terms of, hey, this is an industry issue that we really need to understand. And as an industry, we need to do a better job of managing ourselves in the midst of these events. We're an organization of nearly 500 wine grape growers statewide, and we administer well over 500 contracts a year in conjunction with selling our growers' grapes. Out of those contracts last year, over 80 of those contracts were either subject to rejection or some type of price discount or amendment to the contract based on the smoke. So dollars wise for us was about 12 million, maybe 15 million, somewhere in that neighborhood. You don't really know because the grapes didn't get delivered in many cases, and so we don't know what the potential value was. But we're only a few percent of the California crush as a percentage. So if it impacted us to that degree, then certainly you can extrapolate why the value and volume of a magnitude of the event was so much last year. Our report pointed out there was probably upwards of 300,000 plus tons that probably hung on the vine last year because of smoke exposure that didn't get harvested, with a value of maybe $600 million in grape value. So there's a lot of economic injury when we have these events, particularly when they're widespread like they were last year.
Right. That's that's a stressor that's on everybody's minds right now, or all over the wine grape growing regions. So growers already have plenty of concerns out in the vineyard, right? As far as labor and what weather's going to do, and then we have this wildfire season and not knowing whether or not your grapes will be rejected for alleged inappropriate levels of smoke compounds. Not having any kind of threshold. There's just, all over the board as far as what's going to go and what's not going to go. So can you tell us a little bit about, what growers should do to put their minds a little more at ease when it comes to contracts?
Sure. Well, and all those things that you just covered were really kind of the impetus behind this legal analysis we did, because what we found last year was we don't really have standards in the industry to kind of regulate our behavior as an industry in terms of how do we react to smoke exposure in these kinds of events. And so we wanted to collect the data about how we reacted and identify, there were some extreme reactions that are kind of maybe outside of the box or outside of the standard of where we would like to operate as an industry. And so that's what this paper was about. And the reality is we don't know, from a scientific standpoint, we don't know a lot of the things we need to know. That's why research is ongoing. That's why there's a need for funding for this research to continue so that we as an industry can better manage ourselves. In the meantime, we wanted to identify what behaviors are outside of maybe the norm, or what we should consider as an industry normal behavior under these situations. And so that our paper pointed all of that out. It certainly wasn't meant to paint with a broad brush in terms of people's reactions. It was actually more of, hey, these are extreme reactions. This is what happens outside of the normal operation. And so growers can maybe avoid some of those things happening to them under their contract situations with some education about what you should look for in a contract clause with regard to smoke exposure. So a lot of those items are covered in the paper. We covered it on our webinar, which is available online, even if you didn't attend the webinar. And so there's lots to learn there.
What were some key points? If the winery wants to talk with you about smoke and what expectations there are in the contract, maybe renegotiating, some of the terms and conditions. What are some points that they should, be looking out for and making sure of?
Well, we definitely recommend that anybody with a contract that doesn't have a smoke exposure clause talk with their buyer, or their buyer talk with their grower about putting one in, amending the contract to have some guidance that is agreed upon by the two parties with regard to how they'll handle a smoke exposure event. Again, for growers, this entire issue is about risk. And so smoke exposure essentially falls on the grower. This is something that happens in the vineyard during the growing season. We want growers to be able to mitigate that risk by being knowledgeable about crop insurance options, being knowledgeable about how much smoke or what types of smoke could damage their crop, what levels are actually excessive and which might not be. What we're seeing is in some cases, wineries, through their legal counsel, are just trying to protect themselves to the maximum degree by writing in a no tolerance, let's just say zero tolerance policy for smoke exposure. That's fine if that's the position that a winery wants to take, and they're buying $8,000 a ton Napa Cabernet. Then that's just additional risk in the contract that the grower needs to know is there and exists.
But the fact of the matter is these kind of compounds occur naturally as well, right? So if you have a zero tolerance and you get any kind of level, they might have had that even well before, any, harvest season approached.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So we could have a situation where they occur naturally, a smoke event happens. We do an analysis in a lab that actually pulls all the compounds out and measures them, not just the free and available compounds, but actually releases the bound compounds to be measured. And we could be measuring the complete potential there for that wine to have a smoke impact. And that might not be a good reflection of how the end result, how the end wine would turn out. And so those are the kinds of things that growers need to be aware of, because again, depending on the clause in the contract, they're going to potentially need to negotiate a higher price for that risk because they might have to go out and buy crop insurance or buy up in the level of crop insurance they have. And so those are the types of things that we covered in the report and in our webinar.
Yeah, so it's really good to have some kind of analytical reason or threshold, but also a more of a sensory threshold as well, because you might have higher levels, but you might not taste anything, right?
That's exactly right. We had a lot of situations last year where we entered into post-harvest evaluation agreements with wineries. So the winery said, look, the smoke's been around. We can't get the lab tests back in time to understand whether these grapes are truly impacted. So we'll go ahead and bring it in and measure it, and then we'll talk after that. And so we agreed to that in a lot of cases. The majority of those, clear majority in our experience, those wines were fine. They had been impacted by smoke. They even came back with numbers that were detectable in terms of smoke compounds. So they didn't register zero. They came back as the compounds were present, but the wine, it didn't manifest itself in the wine. And so I would say 9 out of 10 of those types of agreements we entered into, we ended up getting full price or some type of substantial price for those grapes versus a full rejection, just because there was compounds in it. And that's what we really want to work against is verbiage that says if we detect any compounds measurements at all, we're going to reject. That's pretty extreme.
Yeah. And you may be really comfortable with your winery and have a long-term relationship, but in stressful conditions and rough markets, you never know what can happen, right? So it's really important that we have the legal aspect of things taken care of in an appropriate manner. So thank you. There's a lot more that was covered in this webinar. Read more about it in the coming issue of American Vineyard Magazine. I'm Matthew Malcolm, CaliforniaAgNet.com.